Hi everyone, my name is Ofri. I really appreciate that you came that early. I'll do my best to make your hangover from last night as painless as possible. I'm really excited to be here today and to share with you the discovery of a vulnerability in the VMware's vSphere platform. So a bit about myself. I'm leading Guardicore Labs, the research arm of Guardicore. Guardicore is a data center and cloud security company focused on delivering effective ways to stop advanced threats targeting both public and private clouds. Our work includes the discovery of the botnet army and the release of the infection monkey tool that we presented last year on this stage. So here is the agenda for this session. We will provide a general overview of the host-guest isolation model in the context of the vulnerability. We will provide a use case that demonstrates the separation of duties inside a data center. We will go over the attack flow, do a short demo, and last we will provide mitigation and our own risk assessment tool. So VMware vSphere is a very popular virtualization problem for on-premises data centers. And just like any other virtualization platform, it basically relies on host servers running guest machines. These hosts and guest machines can be managed using different administration interfaces such as the vSphere API and the VIX API. In this session, we will disclose a vulnerability in the vSphere infrastructure that can be exploited using the VMware API. This exploitation exposes VMware customer base to a remote code execution in their data center guest machines. So enterprises require that their infrastructure teams have no access to the data stored on the machines they administer. And a separation like this is crucial for compliance, for privacy reasons, to do defense in depth. For example, most companies will allow their infrastructure teams to create, modify, even delete guest machines, but they deny them guest operating system operations like file manipulation or console interaction. So to this end, the industries use VMware's rich security model to separate between the infrastructure domain and the guest machines domain. And this quote is taken from the VMware documentation, and it relates to the isolation between a host and its guests. As stated by VMware, guest machines should be isolated from the host, and the interaction between them needs to be well understood and documented. So VMware continues to explain how they keep the segmentation between host and guest planes, or data and control plane, if you like. To execute guest operating system operations, you must authenticate with two distinct security domains, the vSphere host and the guest operating system. Now, VMware API exposes a built-in functionality that breaks this security model, enabling a malicious actor to basically bypass the guest authentication. Now, let me show you how you can take this functionality and leverage it to execute code in the guest machine. So let's try to understand this using this snippet from VMware's data center of one of Guardicore's customers. So this is the vSphere host, and it is part of the network control plane. It runs a guest machine, in this case called patient's data. The guest machine is part of the data plane of the network. It contains sensitive information, and its disk is encrypted as required by regulation. Now, let's meet some of these companies' best people who are working with this data center. So first we will meet Bob. Bob, or Dr. Bob, if you will, whose job requires access to patients' health files. And for that, he has credentials to the patient's data guest machine. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't have credentials to the host server. Now, next we have Alice. Alice is a member of the infrastructure team, and as such, she has credentials to different vSphere hosts, which allows her to perform different maintenance tasks. Now, as required by regulation, Alice does not have credentials to sensitive machines such as patient's data. So when prompted for credentials when trying to connect the patient's data guest machine, well, she's basically clueless. And this is exactly what we would expect from a platform providing such host-guest isolation as this one. But what if Alice was able to escalate her privileges and access the patient's data guest machine? Think about it. What if she could access patients' confidential information? So what we are claiming is that hidden feature inside the vSphere allows a malicious actor to use an undocumented authentication method which bypasses the guest operating system authentication and may lead to a remote code execution on the guest machine. So basically, this undocumented method breaks the host-guest isolation model, and it certainly raises some concerns regarding the ability of VMware to adhere to the concept of separation of duties as required by different regulations. Now, using this method, an attacker can control the guest machine, as it allows a high privilege arbitrary code execution. An attacker can actually utilize this capability to perform lateral movement across the data center. It also allows access to maybe some isolated networks that weren't accessible to the attacker otherwise. Also, this kind of attack, this kind of access and capabilities can be easily used for data leakage or ransomware attacks. So next, we are going to demonstrate the attack workflow, and we'll do it by using our health company use case. Okay, so let's do it step by step. So Alice will first connect to the host using her vSphere credentials, and that will be validated by the authd process. Next, Alice will try to connect the patient's data guest machine VMM, which is the virtual machine manager, using VIX. The authd process will then verify Alice's user has the required privilege that goes by the catchy name guest operating system management by VIX API. Once approved, the authd will call the execve system call and turn itself into the relevant virtual machine VMX process. Now, to connect to the virtual machine itself, the VMX interacts with a VMtools process running inside the guest machine. By default, such a connection attempt will require credentials. And as we already know, Alice is not authorized to access the patient's data guest machine, and as such, she doesn't have these credentials. But luckily for her, a hidden authentication method come to her rescue. And alongside the publicly known and approved authentication methods lies an undocumented one, an undocumented piece of code that allows Alice to bypass the guest authentication. Now, the options parameter for the VIX login in guest function controls the authentication method for the provided credentials. What we discovered is that by modifying the options parameter value to 4, a value which, by the way, you won't find in any VMware documentation, the authentication method is now based on a shared secret that is validated on the host with no guest interaction at all. So once the shared secret has been approved by the VMX process, it issues a ticket and sends it back to Alice. So how do we set such a shared secret? Setting a shared secret can be done using the vSphere API, and it requires the virtual machine advanced config privilege. The virtual machine configuration is built as a key value data structure. The key for the shared secret starts with guest commands shared secret login, followed by a username, and the value is a base 64 encoding of the shared secret string SHA function results. And it's important to understand that there is no specific API that allows us to configure this specific key. You won't find it in the documentation. We were able to come across it while researching the platform. One last thing we will need to set up before allowing a shared secret login is to turn on the shared policy ref count flag. This flag will be checked by the VMX before handling the shared secret credentials. So let's get back to Alice, who just earned her ticket from the VMX. And this ticket will actually allow her to execute code on the guest machine using different API functions, such as run programming guest function. The ticket will allow Alice to do this with no further verification by the guest side. So the only thing that will happen is that the VMX will validate the ticket provided by Alice and forwards the command to the VM tools. The VM tools, in its turn, will execute the command while ignoring the ticket. This doesn't apply to several scenarios that I will cover right after the demo. Okay, so demo time. Okay, so what we have here is a vSphere 6.5 environment. As you can see, my license was expired. So we are going to attack this Windows 2012 machine. The user that we will be using is called VixTest, and his role is VixVuln. Let me show you the privileges of this role. Believe me that it has only the 3 needed privileges for the advanced settings for the host to set the shared policy ref count, and the 2 needed to set the shared policy, the shared secret, sorry. Okay, so this is the console of the machine, and I'll try to log in. And this is the password that I will try. So didn't work. Now we'll run our attack script, which will follow the steps that we saw earlier. Let's go back here. Same password. Okay. And it worked. According to my slide notes, this is where you should clap your hands. And okay, so the root cause for this vulnerability is the existence of an authentication method to the guest machine that doesn't require the guest consent. This is basically a backdoor that exists thanks to the fact that an attacker can bypass this if block code taken from the OpenVMtools source code. Now, around this small piece of code, there were 3 different bugs or features. I guess it depends on which side you are. And they allowed an attacker to bypass this block code. Now, the attack will not be possible if the following 3 things met. So first, if this code block exists in the needs to exist in the VMX binary. And by the way, this wasn't the case in old VMtools versions. Second, the request flags need to be passed properly by the VMX, and they shouldn't be able to control by the attacker, which is surprisingly possible in E6i 5.5. And last, the shared secret authentication method needs to be opted out. And this was fixed only recently. Eventually, a virtual machine will be vulnerable in one of 2 cases. Running on E6i 5.5 or when running a VMtools version older than 10.1. Now, when installing VMtools on a Linux virtual machine, VMware suggests to use OpenVMtools from the distribution from the distribution's upstream repository. And however, the OpenVMtools in different distributions version is prior to 10.1. So it basically means that those operating system will be prone to the attack when running on the platform. We will release a script that will help you to discover vulnerable machines in your data center. And let me give you some mitigation options that I think can be used by VMware customers. So best option would be to update the VMtools version to 10.1 or newer. If upgrading the VMtools is not an option for some reason, you can actually opt out the shared secret authentication method by adding this configuration group to the tools.conf file. This configuration will be effective only if you are running VMtools version 9.9 or newer. Now, for E6i 5.5, even the latest VMtools won't save you. We need VMtools to ignore the request flags that we saw earlier, since the VMX doesn't control it. And what we did is we created a fork of OpenVMtools where we ignore the request flags, and that actually opted out the shared secret authentication method. We will make this version source code available to the public, and we will also provide a binary version of it that you will be able to download from the Guardicore website, together with a procedure with details about how to apply these fixed binaries. So, summing up, check your networks and re-examine your assumptions regarding segmentation of data and control planes. The best way for you to check whether your virtual machine is vulnerable is by running the attack tool. And to map the virtual machines at risk and the users that can threaten them, we encourage you to try our risk assessment tool, all available in the repositories on the screen. And as I mentioned, we will also provide a fixed VMtools version for E6i 5.5, both source and binaries. I want to thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions, now is the time.